Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to CIBC Presents Entrepreneurship 101. A very interesting lecture tonight on negotiation. Why do we include a lecture on that? One of the things I learned very early in mentoring some early stage companies, in particular, there was one individual who had come out of university and he'd won a fellowship to launch his company, and after about a year, I was talking with him. He said, "Boy, nobody told me how much I was going to have to negotiate. I wish somebody had taught me something about that." And I stepped back and I thought, wow, that's right. He had to negotiate with a co-inventor who didn't want to join his company, and that was tricky. And all the business negotiations that he had to get into, including with investors. So for that reason, a lecture on negotiation has been an integral part of this course from day one. And I'm delighted to welcome back tonight Michael Erdle. Michael is managing partner at law firm Deeth Williams Wall, and they're a leading Toronto technology and IP law firm. Now, Michael has practiced primarily in IT and IP, information technology and intellectual property. And, just to quickly go through some of the areas that he's worked in: internet, e-commerce, patent, trademark, copyright protection for IT, technology development, licensing, tech transfers, joint ventures, strategic alliances, public-private sector partnerships, and financing. And I actually have worked with Michael in one particular early stage venture, and I can personally attest to his skills in negotiating term sheets and so forth, and financing early stage ventures. But it's really a specific area that Michael brings expertise in. He's on the board of the ADR Institute of Ontario, and I was thinking, attention deficit reduction? Now that may be appropriate to this audience, but it's not that. That's the Alternative Dispute Resolution Institute, and he's co-chair of their technology and IP section. And so he is an experienced mediator, an arbitrator, and in addition, he's a member of the ADR Institute of Canada. So it's those skills that Michael is well practiced in that he's going to talk to you about tonight. Michael.
Thank you very much, Tony. I'm very pleased to be here again this year to talk to all of you. And I understand this year the mandate of the series has been expanded from strictly business ventures to also include social entrepreneurship. So I will try to address some of those points as well in the talk tonight. It's called Negotiation for Fun and Profit, and a practical guide. And I particularly like this quote that I found some time ago, that in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. I'm going to try to focus as much as I can on some of the practical tips that you can take away tonight. Not so much on theory, but I have to confess there's a little bit of theory in the presentation as well. I'm going to talk about some negotiation problems and some of the common things that as entrepreneurs you will have to deal with, or situations you might experience. But of course, negotiation is everywhere. So hopefully some of these ideas will be ones that you can take home and maybe use tonight when you get home and you have to negotiate what TV show you're going to watch or what to have for dinner. Some of these tips might help. I'll talk a little bit about negotiation skills, and also just at the very end a little bit about dispute resolution, because as Tony said, I am a mediator, a negotiator, mediator, facilitator, negotiator all the time. I'm also an arbitrator, mostly in commercial disputes, but in a wide variety of areas. So I'll talk a little bit about dispute resolution and what you can do sometimes when negotiation itself doesn't work. So what is negotiation all about? And really, it's everywhere. It's everything. Anything and everything is negotiated. You're negotiating all the time. One of the problems with negotiation and developing negotiation skills is that negotiation is something that you learn when you're about 2 years old. And as everyone with a 2-year-old knows, their favorite word is no. That's just a form of negotiation. That's all that is. That's just a way of saying, well, maybe can I have one more cookie, or can I stay up 5 minutes longer? I don't want to go to bed. Everything is negotiated. And you won't stop negotiating until they put you in a box and slide you under the ground. So how do you deal with that in knowing that because you do it every day and you do it unconsciously, sometimes you have to step back and think about what it is you're doing and why you're doing it. And particularly when you're negotiating in a business setting, business relationships, it's a very different type of negotiation than in a personal relationship. Some situations are more emotional than others. Some are simply more important. But often the emotions kind of get mixed up and tangled in the negotiation and make the whole negotiation process more difficult, both for you and for the person you're negotiating with. And part of what I want to talk about tonight is the sense of awareness of what the other person is negotiating about and why is just as important as what you're negotiating about, and why you're negotiating what you need and want has to match up with what the other person needs and wants. So, everything's negotiated. And negotiation can be either about distributing value or creating value. And I'm going to try to talk tonight about some examples how you can turn one situation into the other. Because if you can turn a distributive negotiation where it's a simple win-lose, the more I get, the less you get. It's that easy. That's about distributing value. Creating value is working together so that we each achieve something more as a result of the negotiation. And that's what people call a win-win situation. Not every situation is like that. Some things are purely distributive. But you can sometimes turn one situation into another. The way to do that, I think, is to focus on interests, on underlying interests, rather than just simply positions and simply winning a point. To do that, you need to identify issues. You have to understand very clearly what each side wants and what each side needs. And as I said before, understanding the other position, the other interests, are just as important as understanding your own. And there are different kinds of interests, and there are different kinds of interest dynamics. So in some situations, the interests are mutual. And that is where, for example, members of a group have a common interest and a common goal and are negotiating with someone else, or where the negotiation is about achieving a common goal. And the interests that they're trying to achieve are mutual interests. Both parties, all parties, want to achieve essentially the same thing. In other situations, the interests are complementary. They don't have the same interest, but they work together, and they're not in conflict. And the third situation is conflicting interests. And let me just give you a very simple example, one that's commonly used. A chef, the executive chef in a restaurant, walks into the kitchen one day, and two of the cooks are standing over a crate of lemons. arguing with each other. One says, I need these, I ordered them, I need them, I want them. The other one says, no, these are for me, I need them, you can't have them. And so the executive chef comes up to the two of them and says, what's going on here? What do you need? One says, well, I ordered the crate of lemons, I need it, I'm making lemon meringue pie. And you know, I need to have these. The other one says, well, I've got a whole order of lemonade to make here, and I need to have all these lemons because I've got to squeeze the lemons. Well, the chef says, well, but you need the juice, you need the rind. What's the problem? You take part, you take the other part. You can both have what you want. That's the example of complementary interests, and that's an example of turning what could be conflicting interests around so that they can complement each other. And there are all kinds of examples. I mean, that's just a silly one, but there are all kinds of examples in various situations of negotiation where you can take what appears to be a conflict, and by understanding what's behind it, what the person really wants. It's not that somebody wants lemons. They want the product that they're going to make with those lemons that can lead you in a direction that changes the negotiation and lets you get to an effective solution. To be effective, you need to understand the difference between interests and positions. And a lot of the research and a lot of the writing on negotiation focuses on interests. And that's the difference between needs and wants, I say. What you want may be your position. I want a new car. In fact, I want a fancy new car with all kinds of bells and whistles. That's, you know, a position. What I need is a reliable car that will get me back and forth to work. Because if I don't have that, I can't work, I'll get fired, I'll lose my job. I mean, that's a real need. That's not just a want. I need to have a car. And that is an example of the difference between interests and positions. And if I'm negotiating over getting a car, understanding that what I need may be a $10,000 used car versus what I want, which is a $100,000 brand new Mercedes, shows you the range of negotiation. What I get may be somewhere between the two. But if my needs are met, the result will have been successful. The other thing that is worth pointing out is the importance of separating people from the problem. And what I mean by that is that a lot of negotiation situations falter, a lot of projects collapse, a lot of relationships break up, personal or business, over personal conflicts. People just simply don't get along for whatever reason. And in order to be successful in negotiation, you've got to be able to separate the person that you're dealing with, who you may not like at all. You're never going to be friends, from the problem that you have to resolve together. You're in that situation. You've got to negotiate with that person, and you've got to figure out a way to get around that. So what do you do? How do you approach that? And the answer is to be soft on the person and hard on the problem. You focus on the problem that you have to deal with. You don't attack the person. And it's often very tempting in those types of situations that you attack the person. And if it's someone you don't get along with, there's usually lots of things to attack, lots of things to criticize. I mean, whether it's to them directly or to their boss or to someone else in the group, where the discussion focuses on why this person is a problem. You need to take the focus away from that and deal with what is the real problem. And sometimes, if the person really is the problem, the answer is to remove the person from the situation. And I think everybody's experienced situations where you're never going to get this person to engage effectively or to be part of a team or to work constructively. And sometimes it's just necessary, where maybe by going over their head and dealing with their boss or someone else, or just kind of move them to the side and deal with other people on the negotiating team, but you take the person out of the mix that's causing the roadblock. The other thing is to consider other options. And that is a very difficult thing often to do because you're focused on one line of thinking, one approach to a problem. It's very difficult to overlook the fact that there are lots of other options out there. And you need to be open to those other options and seize opportunities when they come up. Another thing to be really more effective in negotiation, first of all, is preparation. Preparation is always the key. The more information you have, the more you've prepared for any kind of negotiating situation, the better off you're going to be. Whoever has the most information generally is going to be the most successful person in the room in a negotiation. And I mean, we've all experienced that in various situations. I mean, if you're negotiating to buy something, you go to buy a used car, the car dealer always has more information about what the vehicle's worth, what other vehicles cost, how much profit they're going to make, all kinds of information. They have more information than you do. The nice thing now is you can now go on the internet and you can get all kinds of information. There are so many more sources of information and research. You got to make sure they're reliable. I wouldn't believe everything I read on the internet, by the way. Just a little tip. But the information's there. If you can verify it and if you can get objective information, objective alternatives, they're going to position you much better in negotiation. Example of that is in lease negotiations for space. A lot of leases, particularly when they come up for renegotiation in 5 or 10 years, have clauses in them that say the new rent will be the market rate and mechanisms for determining that market rate. Well, if you can obtain objective alternatives, objective information about what that market rate is, then you're in a better position, both now and in the future. But a lot of contracts, a lot of agreements try to pick on some objective information and an objective alternative in order to determine something that the parties maybe can't agree on their own. And if there's some objective standard out there that they can use instead, that makes it a lot easier. The other things that you need to know, and things that are very, very important to understand, is what is your best alternative to a negotiated agreement? If you're in a negotiating situation, you always have an alternative. But you have to understand what is your best alternative, because that is going to dictate how much room you have to negotiate. Again, if you're negotiating to rent space for a new business or a new venture, if one landlord's asking $20 a square foot, and you know that you can go to someplace else and get maybe not quite as nice space, maybe not as convenient, maybe it doesn't have all the amenities, but it's $15 a square foot, and that's your best alternative to a negotiated agreement here over $20 a square foot, you understand what the negotiating range is. And more importantly, you can be pretty sure that the landlord knows what your best alternative is going to be. Again, back to who's got the information. So understanding your best alternative is important. Also understanding what your worst alternative is important. And in a lot of negotiating situations, and particularly I get involved in working with people to resolve disputes. And in most cases, they really underestimate what the worst case scenario is going to be. They underestimate what the worst alternative to a negotiated agreement is. They don't take into account all of the costs of litigation, all of the time that they're going to have to spend before this is settled, and the penalties that they may face if they lose. They focus on what their best alternative. Well, if we can't negotiate a deal here today, we're going to sue them. Well, maybe that's not such a great idea, because if you factored in all of these factors and considered what the worst case scenario may be. So you need to understand the best alternative, you need to understand the worst alternative and what the options are in between. And as I said before, look for win-win solutions. They're not always available. Some things are just win-lose. If I pay a dollar more, I've lost $1. I mean, it's as simple as that. So if we're just negotiating over money and how much I'm going to pay, it's hard to turn that into a win-win solution. But there are sometimes opportunities. Maybe the payment of money isn't the only thing that somebody wants. I've been involved in a number of situations where the resolution of a dispute depended on somebody simply apologizing to the other person. Yeah, we're sorry, we made a mistake. And that contribution, putting that into the package of the negotiated solution, made it possible to agree on a sum of money, which they couldn't do before. The apology on its own is probably not going to be enough. But the apology and some money is more valuable to the person who was injured, perhaps, than more money with no apology. Communication's critical, and relationships are built on trust. So if you don't have that, you end up in a win-lose or even a lose-lose situation. I think most litigation, most lawsuits are lose-lose propositions. Even the winning party in most lawsuits ends up worse off than they were when they started. So just in terms of a quick example of trust and where you can and where you can't have trust, and the importance of negotiation. This is a common game that is used in various game-playing scenarios, but it's useful to understand how lack of communication, because the key to this is the two people can't communicate with each other. So you've got two people, they're arrested, the victim is injured in a robbery, so one or both of them is likely to end up in prison. The key here is they're questioned separately by the police, so they don't have any chance to communicate with each other. And so neither one knows what the other one's going to do. Both of them can be convicted of theft, but there isn't evidence to pin the actual assault on either one of them unless one or both of them confesses. So the dilemma here is, do you confess or not? And here's the catch. If neither one confesses, if they both keep silent, they're both going to go to jail, but only for a year. If each of them confesses and implicates the other, they'll cancel each other out and they're both going to go to jail. But if one confesses and the other doesn't, the one who confesses can cut a deal with the police, can get away free, get out of jail free card, and the other one's going to go to jail for 20 years because they didn't cooperate. So the total jail time is 2 years if they both keep quiet, and 20 years in the other situations. either one or both of them is going to go to jail. So clearly, I mean, there's no question that keeping quiet is the best result for both of them. But only if they can be sure that the other one's going to keep quiet. So, hands up. How many people keep quiet, say nothing? Okay. And how many people implicate their partner to get on? And the rest of you aren't sure? Only about half the people put up their hands. The answer, unfortunately, because you can't be sure what the other one's going to do, is you confess and you implicate the other. Because that's going, for your own, personally, you're better off. No matter what the other person does, you're going to be better off. Oh, I should back up, sorry. Because you can see that regardless of what the other person does, you're going to, you can see, you're going to be better off. If I confess and I implicate the other person, I'm either going to not go to jail at all, or I'm going to go to jail for 10 years, but I'm not going to go to jail for 20. And so in that situation, sad to say, the rational response is to confess, to rat on your partner, and try to be better off. Because you don't know what the other's going to do. Now, if you have 5 minutes together to talk ahead of time, and you can agree, and you've got faith in them that they're going to live up to their agreement, that neither one of you is going to say anything no matter what, and you stick to that, and you both stick to it, you're both going to be better off. So that's true in a winner-take-all situation. In a one-time negotiation where you can win at the expense of the other, and there really is no comeback, there's no retribution, there's really no downside to just acting in your own pure self-interest without any regard for what your partner, your negotiating partner is going to get out of it. But life's not like that. Most negotiations are based on a continuing relationship. You're going to have to negotiate with that person sometime again in the future. It may not be until a long time in the future, but you can bet that they're going to remember. So what do you do when there's a series of games? And the next example is very similar kind of matrix. And this is where you have multiple negotiations, and the only choice is cooperate, don't cooperate. And I've played this game with various groups over the years, and it actually works out very well. And there's been computer models done on it and all kinds of studies done on this game. The points don't really matter except to be clear that if you both cooperate, you get a total of 6 points, which is more than the 5 that you get, right? But you split the points. And the numbers can be whatever you want, but the total points for cooperation has to be more than the points that each individual gets if they don't if they play false and grab all the points for themselves. And of course, if neither one cooperates, they both lose points. And I've done this with various groups, and it's really interesting to see what the result is. And generally we split up into teams, and it's just a series of you lay down cards, right? And the key to this is the players can talk, they can come up to an agreement, and there's always in every group that I've done, there's always 1 or 2 pairs that figure this out early on, and they say, okay, we're going to cooperate, and they do in every round, and they get the maximum number of points, and they split them evenly. And they always do better than the groups that don't cooperate. And I've had them where the groups get into this retaliation mode and they end up with, at the end of the series, with negative points. Neither one of them has any points at all. And meanwhile, the cooperators over here have got the maximum points. And then there's always some in between because they sometimes cooperate and they sometimes don't. And you're never really sure whether the person on the other side is going to cooperate or not. And so it kind of falls apart. The secret to this is a strategy that's called tit for tat. And how it works is you always start by cooperating. You always retaliate immediately if the other person doesn't cooperate. You always go back to cooperating as soon as you can if they cooperate again. And the fourth point is that you're generous. You're not trying to get all the points for yourself. You're trying to maximize the number of points for the team. Because in doing that, you end up maximizing your own points. And as I said, they've done computer models of this game with various scoring and various strategies. And this strategy always wins. It always does better than any other strategy. So you cooperate unless you're provoked. You retaliate immediately. You forgive. Now, the secret is the game has to continue long enough for the retaliation and forgiveness pattern to affect your opponent's behavior. Because if you have somebody who's going to try to play games and try to grab points, you can quickly get messed up. But when I do this with other groups, and I'd love to do it with this group, but it takes a little while to get set up into play. Usually do it for about 10 rounds or so. If you can do about 10 rounds, sometimes even 5 is enough to establish the pattern and to allow you to maximize your benefit. But as I said, the ones who are most successful in this game are the ones who look at it, who agree ahead of time, and who live up to their agreement. And the secret about this game is that you can talk as much as you want and you can agree with what you're going to do. Now, one other point that's not on the slide, but I wanted to mention, is that there's an end game twist to this. If you know when the series is going to end, you know this is our last round, then you don't cooperate. You grab those last 5 points for yourself because the other guy can't retaliate anymore. But if you don't know it's the last round, you can never do that because you know in the next round the other person's going to retaliate and you're going to lose those points. So, negotiation styles. All of us have seen kind of the assertive negotiator, the person who pounds the table, who stomps out of the room. There has to be a balance between assertiveness and empathy. There's really 3 kind of common styles. There's the competitors. They've got to win. They've got to win every argument, every point, no matter how big or small. There's the accommodators who will do pretty well anything to try to get an agreement, to get a deal. I mean, and sometimes it's just to get a deal and get out of there. And sometimes it's because they generally want to be accommodating and they want the other person to get what they need, even at their own expense. And then there's avoiders. There's people who just, they just don't play. Kind of the passive-aggressive types, or call them what you will. But you never know really where they stand because they just won't respond. And it's difficult in mixing those because there's 3 different styles. You get these sort of weird combinations of a competitor with an avoider. It's got to be immensely frustrating for the competitor. 2 competitors can go at it head to head. They can bang heads because each one understands the other. But when you've got different negotiating styles, there's it can be very difficult. And 2 accommodators together, it's going to after you, no, after you. They never get anything done. Communication's the key, and often it's less important. What you say is not as important as how you say it. And that's a question of tone. It's a question of body language. Sometimes it's cultural. Sometimes it's just in how you present yourself. And you have to be aware of that. If you are doing a lot of negotiation, you need to have a great deal of self-awareness. Sometimes you have to act out a role to force a point, to get an agreement. You have to adopt a style that's not your own. But you need to be aware of what you're doing and how you're presenting it. It's important when you're involved in negotiation to understand and to see the difference between understanding and compromise. So what is said here is understanding and recognition don't necessarily mean compromise and concession. So saying I understand is not saying that you agree. It's important in a negotiation to show that you understand what the other person's saying, what they want, what they ask for. That doesn't necessarily mean you agree with them or that you're going to give them what they want. But understanding is a critical first step. And people often get mixed up. I've often seen situations where people are involved in negotiation. They're sitting across the table. One person's making a point. The other person's sitting there. They're nodding their head. They're saying yes, yeah, okay, yeah. That doesn't mean they're agreeing with any of it. All they're saying is, yeah, I understand what you're saying. I hear you. But the person who's making the point sees the head nodding, hears the ahas and yeah, okay, yeah, and thinks that the other person is agreeing with them and is immensely upset and frustrated when at the end of all that, the person who's been sitting across the table, nodding their head, making those noises, says, no, I can't do that. So what have we been doing for the last 15 minutes? And your own emotions and subconscious brain have a huge impact on that. Your emotional reaction to something, to somebody's style, to something they say, their personality, to the way that they attack something, can really block your ability to negotiate effectively. And so on the next slide, I've got a little exercise for everyone to do. Now what you have to do, and everybody can do this out loud, is read the color. Don't read the word. Say out loud the color. Start at the top, go to the bottom. Start now. Did anybody, hands up, get to the end without tripping up or making a mistake? Very good. Very good. I'll tell you though, don't feel so proud. Any preschool kid can do it. You know why? Because they can't read. They don't get mixed up in the two sides of their brain, the one that wants to read the words and the other half of their brain that's looking at the colors. And that's what this test is all about. It's the two sides of your brain are in direct conflict. The literal side that reads the words and the creative, emotional side that processes the colors. And so that processing, and it's interesting, the more literal, lawyers have a terrible time with this. I can't get past, I can't get past the second line. Because we're way too literal. We start reading the words. But there's this inherent conflict. And this conflict is going on in our brains all the time. that's the part of your brain that kind of responds automatically to things. It's the adrenaline rush. When somebody attacks you, when somebody starts pounding the table and turns red in the face, and you get that adrenaline rush, and that happens, I think it's about 100 times faster than your conscious response to that stimulus. That subconscious response, that automatic response, is so much faster than your rational response, and that takes over, and it blocks your thinking, and it blocks negotiation. And you have to be able to be effective in negotiation is to step back from that kind of automatic response and process that conflict. I mean, just like you can with the slide and the colors and the words, if you slow down and you separate words, you can do it. A lot of people can do it, but certainly much less than half of the people in the room could do it effectively. But you have to be able to step back and separate your emotions from your rational thought. And it happens to all of us. There's nothing we can do about it. It happens before we even think about it. But you need to understand it when it does happen. So what can you do? We'll talk about negotiation skills. And some of the most important ones. I think the absolute most important negotiation skill you can develop is the ability to listen. Most people, when they're in an argument, when they're in a negotiation, especially when things get heated, they stop listening. The other person's making their point, and about halfway through, you stop listening to what they say because you're thinking about the point that you're going to make in response. The great rebuttal. And you all know this is true in your personal lives. When you have a fight with their spouse or boyfriend, girlfriend, you're not listening to what they're saying, right? You're thinking about what you're going to say. Well, to be effective as a negotiator, you have to be a good listener, and you have to develop active listening. The ability to say, I hear what you say. This is what you want. This is what you need. These are your points. And to reflect that back to somebody so that they understand that you understand. You're halfway there. Because at that point, even if you say no, you've made some progress. Because if you say no without showing that you understand, their response is going to be, you don't understand. And they'll go through all those points again. Understanding, listening, understanding, acknowledging that you understand is very important. Being flexible is also critical. Everybody goes into a negotiation with their lists of demands, the things that they want to get, the things that they'd like to get, the things that they absolutely have to get. But if you can adapt that list to the circumstances that you learn through that negotiation process, you'll be way further ahead. This is one of the reasons why really good salespeople are so good at listening and understanding this, at understanding what the customer wants and being able to change. They're not locked into a sales pitch. They're not locked into telling people what they want, why they want it, why you should buy the car with all of the bells and whistles and whatever. They listen to what the customer wants, they reflect it back, and they change the direction of their pitch, of their negotiation. And they're willing to put whatever into the deal they need to put into the deal to make that sale. In other words, to have a successful negotiation and to close the deal. And so flexibility and openness to other options within whatever boundaries you have and the constraints you have. The other thing is pragmatism, being able to take the best available option. I've been involved in a lot of negotiations that have failed simply because one person just can't ever bring themselves to say yes. They always want to get a little bit more. There's always a better deal around the corner. I've worked with inventors and people in technology companies and startups, and there's always some better deal. So they never actually make a deal. They're always working on a better deal. And that's until they run out of money, and then they're gone. So you have to be open to what the best available option is. And you have to know what your best available alternative is. Back to the point I made before. Some things to be aware of, and these are just some tips, some traps to look out for, and these are some of the classic hard bargaining ploys. Making extreme claims, small concessions, take it or leave it offers, unreciprocated, threats, we better do this or else. Attacks, the good cop, bad cop. I always like the good cop, bad cop. But it works. I mean, if you can use it, it'll work. So, extreme claims, small concessions. What do? Somebody wants to sell me a rug for $100. I offer 10. So, if they're making small concessions, I'll give it to you for 90. Well, I'll go up to 20. Eventually, you're going to get somewhere in the middle. But you make the same types of concessions they're making. Because if they say 100, you say 10, they say 90, you say 50, they say 80, you say 70, you know where you're going to end up, right? Take it or leave it. You don't have to. Make a counteroffer. Just because somebody says take it or leave it doesn't necessarily mean you have to do either one. Offer an alternative. Come up with something new that changes the dynamic, and it's not a take it or leave it proposition anymore. Somebody says, well, this is my best offer. Take it or leave it. You've got to test that. It may not be their best offer, and don't be afraid to walk away. I mean, if it's not as good, as your best available alternative, if it doesn't meet your needs, leave it. They gave you the choice. Unreciprocated offers. Don't negotiate against yourself. Classic situation there is you go in to buy a car. You're sitting there with the salesperson. They write up the offer. And they always say, make an offer. Doesn't matter what it is. Make an offer. They want your signature on that offer form, right? They don't want you walking out the door. And then they disappear into the back room to talk to their boss, right? And they come back and they say, it's not good enough. Make a better offer. I think if you bump it up, I'll see what I can do. You're just negotiating against yourself. You want them to come back with a counter offer. Then you're into the other scenario where offer, counter offer, and the steps may be getting smaller, but you're getting closer together. If you're negotiating against yourself, that's just a recipe for losing. The threats and warnings. I made a little mistake on here. I said, don't make a counter treat. Maybe you should make a counter treat. What I meant to say is don't make a counter threat. I mean, getting into threats and counter threats, and they say, well, if we don't agree, something bad is going to happen. It says, well, if you go in to ask for a raise, and they said, well, if you insist on this raise, we're going to have to move you, or we'll cut your benefits, or we'll have to let you go. And then you respond with, well, if I don't get the raise, I'm going to quit. Now you've just put yourself in a bind. The counter threats are rarely productive. The way to attack that is to challenge the underlying assumptions. So if the response to whatever you're negotiating is a threat that something bad is going to happen if they give you what you want, you challenge that. Why is that going to happen? Why is it bad? What else can we do to avoid that? Can we get some more money from somewhere else? Are there other alternatives? The other bargaining ploy is to just simply attack the alternative. Someone will say, we have to do it this way because we can't do it that way, we can't do it that way. And every alternative you bring up, they just shoot it down. And you need to respond to that by asking for an explanation. Well, what's wrong with this alternative? Why can't we do that? Well, what if we did this instead? and you keep challenging and you keep growing. So I mean, they can keep shooting things down, but eventually, there's something that they can't justify, and that's where you've got something to work with. And the good cop, bad cop, first of all, you can often use the good cop to your advantage, because the good cop in playing that role may offer some things that you can then seize on, and they can't back away from. But the other thing is to negotiate with the boss. I mean, the scenario in the car showroom. If you've got a salesperson there who keeps disappearing into the back room and coming back and saying no, the answer to that is to say, I want to talk to the boss, because you obviously can't make a deal here. They can, so I want to talk to them, because then they can't play games with you. So a little bit, just a couple minutes left, I think. And so let me just talk about dispute resolution. And then I hope there's some time for questions after. So dispute resolution is really kind of a hierarchy. Most disputes are resolved through negotiation. I mean, it's something you do every day, every disagreement, every dispute. Hopefully, you can negotiate a resolution. But what do you do if you can't and you need some help? And so I just want to say a few words about mediation and arbitration. A lot of people don't understand what the difference is. It's some sort of legal dispute resolution, but we're kind of afraid to go down that route because we don't know what we're getting into. Mediation, and most of the kind of mediation that I do is interest-based mediation. And that's a situation where the mediator is a facilitator. And a lot of the engagements that I get involved in, actually, I would call myself a facilitator rather than a mediator, because mediator sounds like there's some sort of legal dispute. Facilitator, I'm just helping them to negotiate a solution. But in either case, that's what I'm doing. And the focus in that is on the parties' interests and not on their legal rights or obligations. They may have a contract or an agreement and they've got some dispute over that, or they're having some sort of disagreement or problem with a relationship. It's not even necessary that it be a legal focus. But to resolve the dispute, you kind of put the legal rights aside for now, and you focus on what the underlying interests are, and you see if you can bridge those, because then the problem goes away. And what you're looking for is options for creative solutions. Now, there's another kind of mediation, and that, if somebody's been involved in litigation, particularly here in Toronto, where there's mandatory mediation through the court, that's the kind of evaluative mediation that some people are aware of, and some people think of that as mediation. It's strictly speaking, it's certainly not the only kind of mediation. But that's where you've got a neutral evaluator, and a lot of those court mediations are retired judges. I think there's often some difficulty with that because they've been trained in their entire career sitting on the bench that they're making the decision. It's sometimes hard to let the parties to the dispute make the decision and settle it. I mean, they're there to settle it. It focuses much more on legal rights and obligations. So I'm a much stronger proponent and advocate for the interest-based type of mediation, using all of the kind of concepts that I talked about this evening of focusing on interests, of exploring alternatives, and trying to help the parties themselves negotiate an acceptable solution, one that works for both of them. Mediators have to have a whole set of skills. I won't, in the interest of time, go into this too much, and you can see the slides later. The key point is that the mediator's not there to make a decision. The mediator's there to guide the process and let the parties decide, and help them to bridge some of the gaps between them, and work with them if they hit a roadblock. If mediation's not successful, then a lot of situations can go to arbitration. And a lot of contracts now have arbitration clauses in as an alternative to litigation and going to court. It is an effective alternative, I think, particularly for commercial disputes, because it is generally quicker, it's less expensive, it's private. And that's really important in a lot of cases, because the publicity associated with a lawsuit, particularly for startup companies, for companies in technology areas, rapidly changing areas, if you get involved in a lawsuit, it becomes public, that can be an absolute killer. Win or lose the lawsuit, it doesn't matter. By the time you've got to the end of it, your company may be history. Arbitration, because it can be focused, the parties control the scope of it, can be much more effective, and it can remain private. And particularly for international disputes, if anybody's involved in international contracts, international joint ventures, arbitration, I think, has a lot of benefits, because the court systems in other countries aren't like ours. The laws are different. The courts don't necessarily work as well. And it is much easier to enforce an award around the world in practically every country than it is to enforce a court judgment. If you get a judgment in some other country and try to enforce it in Canada, it can be very difficult. If you have an arbitration award anywhere in the world and you come to Canada, you can enforce it with very little difficulty. And the same applies. There's an international convention that applies that makes it much easier. So particularly if you're involved in any kind of international business, arbitration is definitely worth looking at. I've included in the slides, so when they're available online, I'd recommend any and all of these books to you if you're interested in reading more about negotiation and learning more about the concepts, and a lot of practical advice in all of these books about how to negotiate in various scenarios, and particularly to deal with difficult people. The Getting Past No book in particular, which builds on the Getting to Yes, which came earlier, is, I think, really interesting, because it tells you how to deal with seemingly intractable problems where somebody just says, no, absolutely not, never. And you can get past that and get to an agreement. And with that, then, I'm open to questions if we have time, and if anybody has any. Yes, now do we have to go to the microphone? I think so, yes, so that you can pick it up. And for those who have to leave, thank you very much for your attention. Appreciate it. Yeah.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, hi. As you pointed out, that there's often quite a gap between what you need and actually what you want. And the typical strategy often is, to start up with what you want and work your way down to what you need. In your experience, what is the utility or the benefit of being more transparent about what you actually need when you enter a negotiation versus being a little bit more opaque, not revealing exactly what you need and starting with what you want?
I think there's a benefit in not being too transparent right away. I mean, there's a basic premise that if you don't ask, you won't get. And sometimes just by asking for what you want, maybe you'll get it. So there's no harm in asking. My wife, who's a way better negotiator than I am, always tells me if I'm reluctant to ask somebody, and I'm notoriously reluctant, to go back to somebody and ask, we're here a store, kind of ask for a discount. She says, well, what are they going to do if you ask? Are you going to say, oh, sorry, you asked, now we have to kill you? No, they can say no, and then, then you go to your next step. I think it's useful to have to have steps in any negotiation.
Sure.
If you're too transparent and you start with what you absolutely need, your bottom line, you've got nowhere to go. And the dynamics of negotiation are that people generally don't believe that you're going in with your best offer. People they don't expect it, and so it's not going to help you.
Great, thank you.
But I would also then say, as the process continues and you develop more trust and confidence in the person you're dealing with, then you can become more transparent.
Great, thank you.
Do you have maybe a set of tactics, maybe a top 3, that you can use to draw information from your counterparty?
Ask questions. I think asking a lot of questions and listening. Asking people to explain the points. I mean, I do that, and I do a lot of licensing and contract negotiations, and where people will sometimes put ridiculous terms in a contract or clauses that I don't agree with, and I always just ask, well, why is this here? Why do you need that? Why is that necessary? How does that help you? If they can't explain it, then away it goes.
Okay.
And you deal that a lot with negotiating contracts, and you have lawyers or people on the other side who've got some clause in there that they don't know why it's there, they don't know what it's for. If they can't explain it, then I don't have to agree to it.
Thanks.
Hey, I had an actual mentor friend who told me that unless you're willing to walk away from the negotiation, that you couldn't actually win. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think you have to know, and this is why I say you need to know what your best alternative to a negotiated agreement is. And that's absolutely critical. There may be situations where you have no alternative. But if you know that, you're not going to win the negotiation. You do the best you can, but you're going to have to take whatever you're given because you have no alternative. But if you have an alternative, you know what it is. You know when you can walk away. And you always have to be prepared to walk away.
Thank you.
Can you give us one real-life example from mediation which failed and actually went to arbitration and it never went further? It was resolved over there without names of the company or whatever, like some kind of real
actually,
situation.
I have recently an example that went the other way. I mean, there's a number of examples of mediations that didn't work and went to arbitration. I actually had a case recently where I was appointed as an arbitrator. There was an arbitration clause in a contract. And after they got a ways into it, but before the arbitration hearing, I suggested that maybe they could settle it. And I offered to act as mediator. And kind of the kind of mediation, the hybrid kind of mediation arbitration process, it's not that common, but it actually worked. It took us a while to agree on what all of the terms were in the ground rules, because if they didn't settle, I'd have to go back to being an arbitrator, and I had to make sure that wasn't compromised. But because I knew something about the case, they agreed that I would be the mediator, and we had a meeting at our office for one day, and they settled the case. So that's one that went from arbitration to mediation and settled. They had to go to arbitration because it was in their contract that they had to go to arbitration, but they were actually better off settling it through mediation. There's lots of cases that go the other way because a lot of situations have this step. We'll try to negotiate a solution. If we can't negotiate, we'll bring in a mediator, we'll work with them, we'll try to negotiate or settle it, and if we don't settle it within a certain time, we go to arbitration. The interesting thing about that is that most cases going through the mediation process on the way to arbitration resolves at least some of the issues. So the arbitration goes from being this big to being that big, and so that much quicker and that much less expensive. So there's a benefit, even if the case doesn't settle completely, to going through that process. Yep.
Hi there. What would you recommend for those who are perhaps more accommodating than is necessary, folks who need to work on their competitive skills?
Yeah. Well, I speak from personal experience there. First thing is you have to be aware of it. You have to understand that that's your natural tendency. And you have to resist the tendency to just jump in and make a concession, or make an offer, or negotiate against yourself. All of those scenarios I talked about, the people who are accommodating will end up hurting themselves often. Simply by stepping back, I think, is the best way. And to try to be a bit more competitive and be a bit more assertive. Even if it feels awkward. The difficulty that most people who are like that have is when they're playing that role and being more competitive and more assertive, they don't really like themselves very much. It feels awkward, and they don't like the way they sound. And they think, well, the person on the other side must just hate this. But if you have a competitive person on the other side, you have to be competitive in return. There's just no avoiding it, unfortunately. Time for...
From a personal experience, like Michael, I tend to fold really easily. And years ago, we were looking for a weekend property, discovered a farm that I fell in love with. And the asking price, and so put in a fairly low-ball offer. They came down incrementally. And my point here, I have a good friend who is a superb negotiator. So my point is in this case, if you can work with other members of your team, if it's you personally, because he said, no, go back with your original offer. I said, no, Andy, that's not the way negotiation works, right? They had a price, I get an offer, they came down, I'm supposed to go out. He said, no, send a signal. This is your price, what you're willing to pay. So reluctantly, I did that. Imperfect knowledge. I didn't know that the vendor had a wife who wanted to build a new house. And when she learned that there was an offer, it was taken. So my point here, if you can get someone to help you, to have the courage to go low, it can work wonders.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good point. And I find too, one of the things, because my job is to negotiate for other people. I'm a much better negotiator on behalf of other people than I am for myself. Because I'm not emotionally attached to it, or I'm not involved. I have some distance to it, so I can be a much better negotiator. So that also is helpful. But I think Tony's absolutely right. If you can get someone to help you with the negotiation, to give you a little bit more backbone and resist, that's a big help. Yeah, I think you were first.
Yeah, so my question is sort of in the same subject. When you were discussing negotiating styles, you were talking about competitive versus an avoidance type of approach, and how that would be particularly frustrating for someone who's competitive. So if a person has that competitive type of approach, what sort of advice would you give them if they're dealing with someone who's an avoider or passive aggressive, as you put it?
I think you need to find a way to engage them. And I think people who are naturally competitive also have to sometimes step back and recognize that being overly aggressive can be counterproductive too. Sometimes you have to be aggressive, and you have to stick up for what you want or insist on your point. But if you're finding that the other person is continually backing away and not engaging at all, and you're not getting anywhere, I think it helps to be less competitive, less aggressive, to kind of cool it down a little bit without giving up anything, if you will. Because some people are just simply intimidated and into nothingness, and that doesn't help. Yep.
Hi, I'm from Well of Change. I really liked your session, and we were in a scenario where we were negotiating something, and the other party was actually was really good, but they had a colleague that came in partway through. And what do you do when you deal with someone on the other side that isn't so cooperative, and how do you remove them from the conversation?
One of the things you can do is just address the person that you've been dealing with and kind of sideline, and it may take a while, but the person who's not, and not just not necessarily cooperative, but is actually kind of interfering with the deal, or blocking you from closing the negotiation and finalizing it, you can sideline them. And I've seen lots of situations where people who were involved in a negotiating team, you find halfway through the process, they're not in the loop anymore. They're not being copied on the emails. They're not being invited to the meetings. They may still be involved in the background, but even their own team members recognize that they're a problem, and kind of move them into a supporting role. It's difficult when the person who's the problem is the ultimate decision maker, because you can't get around them. But if it's a person who's not really a decision maker, but they've got some stake, it's often the case in an organization where you've got different stakeholders, call them, different interest groups. One part of the organization wants to do the deal, another one for their own personal reasons, it's going to take away from their prestige, or their job may be lost if this deal goes through, or whatever. They're doing everything they can to sabotage it. And you've got to recognize that dynamic and somehow address it. Deal with the people who want the deal and sideline the ones who don't.
Okay, you had an interesting quote at the beginning of the presentation from a fellow named Jan van de Snapshot, right?
Yes.
Is that that computer science fellow who wrote a thesis by hand in the 90s and then killed himself? Or?
Well,
Yeah.
I don't know about killing himself. I hadn't heard that. But yeah, he was a computer scientist, I think, at Stanford. For a long time, I didn't know I really liked that quote, and I didn't know where it came from. And somebody who saw it on something that I'd published actually told me where it came from. But yeah, it's a computer scientist.
And I have another question, if I may. You mentioned the games for practicing negotiation.
Yes.
Are you aware of any good online sites where we can practice these negotiation games for free?
I don't offhand. There are a number of kind of game theory sites. Some of them are fairly esoteric, and they don't kind of really help you in negotiating, although some of them can help you in understanding dynamics of different situations. The Getting to Yes and Getting Past No books, and I don't know what material they may have online now. I haven't looked recently, but if you look for Getting to Yes and Getting Past No, I mean, they have a lot of scenarios and very practical tips on how to deal with different problems in different scenarios. So they're very good sources.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Michael. I have a question on a topic that we haven't dealt with tonight, on stereotyping and expectations. We all have stereotypes, we all have expectations. Mm-hmm. In negotiation, what if the other party holds a stereotype about you that doesn't really match at all your negotiation skills? For example, women perceived to be more passive and less competitive, especially Asian women. What if I happen to be a competitive negotiator and I take the other party completely by surprise and he or she doesn't know how to respond?
Well, I think that's very helpful for you, because if you can take them by surprise, you've got the upper hand. I think it often takes quite a bit of work to reset expectations. If you're dealing with somebody who comes into a negotiation with a set of expectations that are false, and those expectations may be about you personally or your negotiation style. It may be about what's on the table, how much money you have to spend, or how much money you're willing to pay, or how badly you need whatever it is they're offering. Often there's situations where people come into negotiations with totally the wrong expectations, and often there's a set of assumptions, stereotypes, cultural differences. If you're involved in international negotiation, that's often the biggest stumbling block. And people who have got a lot of international experience have a huge advantage of knowing how to deal with different negotiation styles, different sets of expectations. I think it's a great advantage if somebody underestimates you, because you can use that to your advantage. On the other hand, if somebody's is just simply ignoring what you say or something like that for those reasons, then you've got an uphill battle to convince them. No, I really mean it.
Thank you.
Hi, Michael. It sort of slid past this in a way. This is the question where, let's take a startup for the sake of argument. There's maybe 3 or 4 partners. And yes, eventually you have to go and negotiate something, be it IP or financing or something of that nature. What can that group of 3 or 4 people do long before you actually get to the negotiation stage, to prepare themselves as a unit or as a group? That doesn't mean they all go in, but
right.
as a group, how do they prepare themselves for, because they each have different personalities, as we've heard, and different traits and stereotyping, whatever. But at some point, how does that group prepare themselves?
I think the first thing that any group has to do, or any negotiating team, first of all, they need to negotiate amongst themselves about what it is that they want and what it is that they need. I found that a lot of negotiations have run into trouble because the people you're negotiating with can't agree among themselves. And so it's kind of a moving target. You don't really know what they're trying to do, what they're trying to accomplish. Why objections suddenly pop up? Well, it's just because someone else, as someone said earlier, someone new has come into the mix with their own agenda and their own set of demands. So I think the most important thing for your group internally to prepare for a negotiation is to sit down and hammer out among yourselves what it is you want to accomplish, what you absolutely need, what your alternatives are. Share as much information as you can. Often, different people in the group have bits of information that can become critical or be a critical advantage in the negotiation. Decide what your approach and what your style is going to be. Who is going to front the negotiation? Who's going to be the lead negotiator? And that may change from one situation to another. I mean, within a team, you may have one person that's negotiating with others in the academic community and needs one sort of style versus who's going to go and sit down with the banker when it's time to negotiate alone. Because those two approaches, those two negotiation problems are very different. And you may have people on your team with different styles that are going to perform better in those two situations. So you decide among yourselves who's going to be the lead negotiator, who's going to be supporting. You know, if you're going to have kind of a good cop, bad cop approach, you know, who's going to be the bad guy? And that's often one thing that people hire lawyers for, by the way. It's not that we're inherently nasty. It's our role is bad cop in a lot of negotiations. As it should be, because that allows the business person to be the good guy. And when you get down to the short strokes, to come in and say, okay, let's make a deal. And be the one who you know, cuts through all that and closes the deal, you know, with the business person on the other side so they can be friends again. Because they've got to work together. You know, I get to go home and I don't have to live with, you know, all the unreasonable positions that I've taken along the way. But that's a negotiation strategy that you need to sit down and work out ahead of time.
Thank you.
I sometimes find myself negotiating in a real time crunch. And if the party is at all intelligent, the other party, they will know that the longer they drag the feet, the less wiggle room I have, and they hope to turn it to their advantage. What it can, in fact, sometimes do is, you know, scupper it for both parties. It's stressful. How do I keep the negotiations, you know, marching along? What strategies can I use?
Well, if you can find a way to use the time crunch to your advantage, that can help. The other party may be under a time you know, pressure as well. You know, there's a good reason why most labor negotiations settle, you know, at 1 minute to midnight when the strike deadline is midnight. Because that time pressure, you know, focuses everybody. Now, you're absolutely right about it being stressful, and the result can often be a bad deal because people have been forced by time, you know, to agree to things that they probably shouldn't have, and if they, you know, were better rested and wider awake and had more time to think about it, they wouldn't have done it. But, you know, they have a deal, and maybe you know, concluding the deal is better than not, and just simply walking away. The other thing is to find ways to take that pressure off, to buy yourself more time. That's often the case in financial negotiations. You know, if you're negotiating with an investor, you know, and they know you're going to run out of money at the end of the month, and they're using that to their advantage to negotiate a really hard deal on the investment terms. You know, if you can get a bridge loan for 2 months, you know, that takes the pressure off and maybe gets you a better deal. So finding ways to take that time, to remove that time pressure, to buy yourself more time, to put time equal, you know, or to put time pressure on the other party, both those things can help.
Do you have any advice how to deal with difficult people, let's say among equals? For instance, board of directors,
yeah.
They have liability insurances, and they have big egos, and, you know, sometimes they try to litigate, sue,
yeah.
You know.
The strategy for dealing with difficult people, and there's whole books on how to deal with difficult people, so you can't answer it in 30 seconds. But I'll go back to the point I made earlier about being soft on the person and hard on the problem. So you take the focus off the person and the fact that they are personally difficult or objectionable, and you focus on the problem. And you bring the discussion then back to the problem. So it's not about them anymore. It's about something else.
Thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask you, what strategy can you use if you can't play tit for tat, if both the sides are not on equal level and you're, I guess, on the disadvantaged side? And you don't have the option to walk away.
Well, you always have the option to walk away. It may not be a good option, but you always have to preserve that option. The best thing that I can suggest in that situation is to try to develop other alternatives. I'll go back to what I said before about the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. If you're in a situation where you see that the negotiation isn't going well because your alternatives are all bad, so your best alternative is a bad alternative, the best thing that you can do to strengthen your negotiating power is to try to develop better alternatives. So you're not, placing everything on the outcome of that negotiation. So if you can create alternatives that give you the option to walk away and do something else, or improve the value of those alternatives, you'll be better off. It's not always possible, but that's what you should be looking for. And you can create alternatives within that negotiation. And there's lots of examples that people have given of where you're negotiating over you're negotiating over the rent of an apartment, say, which and you don't really you don't have an alternative, and you're stuck with whatever they're going to offer. But the apartment comes with a parking spot. You don't have a car. Well, you create an alternative by saying, I'll take the apartment without the parking spot. You can rent the parking spot to someone else and knock $200 off my rent. And now you've improved your negotiating position. And you can now perhaps come to a better solution than if you were just negotiating over, well, how much is the rent going to be?
I have a question. So basically, I've been working on this product for almost 3 months, and if I work by myself, I'm probably gonna launch it within 3 months. But the thing is, I want to, because I'm still in school, right? Mm-hmm. So I kind of want to collaborate with my friend, so that we can work together and then make it faster, right? Launch it faster. And my question is, having your friend to try your product, to the same project, which means you gotta split the profit, right? And I just don't know how to arrange that profit financially and properly, so that we can agree on a deal. And because I've been working on this project for 3 months, right? Yeah. Yeah.
So how to negotiate the partnership?
Yeah,
between the two of you. It's always difficult. It's probably most difficult to negotiate with friends, because you've always got that dynamic that if the negotiation doesn't work out, you may lose a friend. And even if it does work out and you start working together, if the whole thing falls apart after a couple months, then you'll definitely lose a friend. So negotiation with friends, with relatives, with people that there's some other relationship with, and now you're negotiating a business relationship, is always trickier. But I can't really tell you what to do. I mean, it depends on what you bring to the project, what your friend brings to the project, who's going to do what. I mean, there's a lot of things that you have to sit down going into something like that and talk about. And I find a lot of situations that end up badly, it's because people didn't sit down and talk about them ahead of time. They just kind of launched right into it and said, well, we'll work out all those details later. I've had partnership disputes where the partners never even agreed on how they would split the profits. They, is it 50-50 or something else? And they said, well, we never really talked about that. How did you launch into this without knowing what the deal was. But time is a factor. We got to do this right away. We'll talk about that later. My suggestion is to sit down with your friend now and say, this is what I want to do. You want to be part of it. This is how we're going to do it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
One person effectively switch between the styles, or do you have to have two different people with their own style?
You can. You can. And some really good negotiators are good at changing gears, at being, at being very cooperative and helpful at sometimes, and then just, losing their temper and, when somebody was being unreasonable on the other side. And I worked for a long time with a woman on a renegotiation of a deal, and she was the lead negotiator for my client. And she was very calm and even-tempered, but one day, at a meeting that was going badly, she just completely lost it. I'd never seen it before. Huge temper, packed up her stuff, stormed out of the room. And so all of us packed up our stuff, followed her out. She was out in the hallway, and the first thing she said, so you think that worked? And it did. It did. It caused the people on the other side to kind of completely reset how they were approaching that problem, because they didn't want to see that again. So yeah, you can, but you got to think carefully about it. And if it comes off that you're just playing for effect, that's not really you, it doesn't get you. But that on that day in that room, everybody believed that was the end. Yeah. Well, thank you all very much.